Love is not what you need. Supernatural thing is not what you feel. You can see in thoughts. Is it really yours? Come and hold me now. I can make you feel. If you don't know.
All right. So just as a preface, everyone, whoa, I'm not a full expert. I'm not even anywhere close to an expert on Daoism. I've read 2 translations, and I just found a lot of interesting comparisons to Law of One. And so I thought it would be useful to kind of talk about Daoism and kind of go over a little bit of the history because we don't have a lot of time. So let's just start into where when was Daoism first created? Basically, so it's an older religion, spiritual practice. It's actually, I think it has the official title of the second most translated book, the Tao Te Ching, which is the core book. I'm guessing the Bible is the first, but I actually don't even know. But so it's hypothesized that basically there was someone called Lao Tzu in around 500 basically BC in China, around the Western Pass, and don't ask me where exactly that is. I'm sure I could Google it, but basically somewhere in China. And what's interesting is, normally I think if you really want to engage with the Tao Te Ching at a deep level, I would definitely encourage you to read through the chapters. It's not very long. There's 81 verses or chapters, depending on how you translate it. And let's see if I have a book. I don't have my printout right here. But as you'll see, as we'll go through, we'll actually probably go through maybe a third or half of it because it is pretty brief. But because they're translations, you have to obviously kind of take the meaning very broadly and kind of search for what maybe the original author meant. I would encourage you to kind of read over it if you're interested and come to your own conclusions. But because this is a very compressed presentation, I'm going to give you my kind of conclusions, hopefully so you can kind of get a better understanding as to the lens I'm bringing, okay? So supposedly some of the mythology behind, I say mythology because supposedly according to, let's see here, we don't have to share my screen just yet, but I'm just bringing up a page that talks about the history of Daoism. So it's a little unclear as to whether there was someone who actually existed or whether it was a combination of authors who wrote the Tao Te Ching, but it's originated around 500 BC. The mythology behind if there was an individual, was that basically there's this individual who was kind of trying to spread a more peaceful, I would say positive philosophy in China during this era that was pretty unstable. I think the Zhou dynasty, if that's how you pronounce it, was kind of destabilizing, and it was entering a warring states period as the historical era that started at 481 BC. So it was kind of destabilizing, and he was trying to help others and just kind of spread this new philosophy, and no one was listening. So what does he do? He's like, I'm peacing out. So as he's apparently walking through the western pass of the final gate on the edges of the empire, some people had apparently heard of him, and so the gatekeeper is like, hey, don't just leave us, write us a book of your teachings. Because he said he was going to leave and never come back. And we'll talk about this specifically if it reminds you anything talked about in Raw, right? So the gatekeeper supposedly convinces him or her, by the way. I actually think that there's evidence if it is an individual, it might have been a female so-called master, right? To write a manuscript of basically his or her philosophy. And they did so and gave it to the gatekeeper, and that's now the Tao Te Ching. So what's interesting, just to kind of notice from right off the bat, is, does anyone recall Ra talking about what sometimes happens when people get frustrated with interacting with other individuals in a yellow ray kind of society? What do? Right? Or what is a common distortion that can take place? Does anyone remember that passage from Ra? Brian, I see that you have an answer.
So when they have a yellow ray blockage, what happens?
Yes, specifically, there's a passage about retreating from the yellow ray. Does anyone into the orange ray? Does anyone remember that?
Yeah, I remember what you're referring to, sort of like becoming a little bit self-absorbed. I
Right.
remember the gist of it being.
Right. So that's kind of his retreat from society and going out into the wilderness, his or her, and never being seen again, supposedly. Reminds me of that passage. And the reason I'm mentioning this, and normally I wouldn't have mentioned this because I think you should draw your own conclusions from reading the history and material, but it colors my interpretation of what is about to come. So I think Lao Tzu was kind of having this distortion where they were frustrated with their ability to communicate on a yellow ray basis with society. And frankly, who hasn't been there at one point? I know that I get frustrated. So they're kind of leaving. And what's also kind of evident, and this is in the material, so there's basically, I would say, five kind of categories of verses that I think are useful to kind of look into. Well, one, some people hypothesize that Lao Tzu tried to spread their philosophy when they're in civilization to leaders and rulers, because apparently during the war, right as this period of what was called the Warring States, there's a central government in China that was supposedly very, very weak. And then all the individual provinces had like their own, I guess, governors or warlords that were very powerful. And a big part of why things weren't working out is none of the individual provinces were working together with one another. They were basically on the verge of breaking up and becoming their own independent states. So supposedly, some of his verses are very much geared towards leaders, like rulers. And so there's an entire class of verses that are leadership based. Then there's four other categories I put into where basically they're talking about the Tao. So the Tao, and we'll get into this, there's parallels to intelligent infinity, intelligent energy, and the creator. Another category of verses is there's an exploration of masculine and feminine energy. As Jeremy knows, this is a very deep subject you could go into, probably because I blame Ra. Ra doesn't really give us much guidance on this. Clearly, though, it is some sort of archetypal energy because as anyone who's looked at the Ra described archetypes, male, female, they're very ever-present symbols. And in fact, when Ra talks about describing the archetypes, they'll get into that masculine, feminine polarity aspect. So that's one aspect of some of the verses, masculine and feminine. Another one is just straight up polarity, and we'll talk about that. And then a final category of verses is kind of like techniques of how to apply this to your own life. So what's interesting, though, is definitely another thing I noticed in Daoism that I feel is common in a lot of different spiritual practices. And I'm trying to think, I don't know if the law of one talks about this, but basically this concept that you can take action to prepare yourself for wisdom or enlightenment or whatever you want to call it, right? Rod definitely recommends exercises. I think every practice recommends taking action, doing something. And sometimes action can be, sitting in meditation. But it's I would term it something that's masculine oriented, where if you want to put a loose definition on masculine, like directing, creating, creating, or giving. So it's basically doing something. But a lot of these spiritual practices, I definitely Buddhism, at least for the few different types of Zen Buddhism that I've looked into, Hinduism talks about this, mystical Hinduism talks about this. The Power of Now, Eckhart Tolle talks about this, that ultimately you just prepare yourself for that wisdom and enlightenment, but you cannot do it. It comes to you. You receive it. And when we talk about the feminine, once again, not a comprehensive definition, but I would say the feminine is about attracting and receiving. So what's interesting is that there's very much, in a lot of ways, I think the Tao Te Ching is a bit more feminine oriented. And I think for me, it's almost like Lao Tzu was in the stage of their life where they're ready to retreat, become a hermit, and just sit in meditation and receive. So I think between the whole maybe retreating it a little bit into Orange Ray and concentrating on enlightenment, it gives a very much more feminine oriented energy. And maybe also, I mean, you could say throughout history, the masculine energy has been very distorted, right? And maybe less so the feminine energy. So maybe that's another reason for kind of a more focus on the feminine energy. Okay, so just to kind of dive right in. So let's go ahead and start sharing. Entire screen. Let's just do window, actually. Okay, so can everyone see basically the first verse here, Dao De Jing?
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, in terms of translations, you can just Google, you know, top 10 translations on Dao De Jing, and, you know, there's like more than one page where they'll just show you verse 1 as translated by different authors. So I kind of looked into that, and what I found was J.H. MacDonald's translation to be, it really spoke to me. I think other people would say, at least if you read Reddit and stuff, that it's a more arcane translation. But I think because it leaves the words a little vague, it actually is better suited for an in-depth kind of understanding of the philosophy. Because, you know, with any deep spiritual philosophy, it's not just reading the words and understanding with the mind. It's really sitting in meditation and trying to understand these concepts in you know, in a very spiritual or spirit-based sense. Okay, so the first one, the first verse, I put in the category of there's some parallels between intelligent infinity, intelligent energy, and the creator concepts in Ra. So I'll just I won't read through every verse, but I'll read this one. The Tao that can be described is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be spoken is not the eternal name. The nameless is the boundary of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of creation. Freed from desire, you can see the hidden mystery. By having desire, you only see what is visibly real. Yet mystery and reality emerge from the same source. This source is called darkness. Darkness born from darkness, the beginning of all understanding. So once again, remember, this is a translation. So you take these words as pointing to the ultimate concepts. But you know, as we go along, my impression was very much that Lao Tzu was a person who experienced, probably opened the gateway from the positive path to intelligent infinity. And also, this is, it sounds like they didn't have too many other people to process this with. And there's actually some historical precedent that Lao Tzu felt very alone. No one was listening to him. So to me, this kind of is like someone trying to put into words this contact with intelligent infinity, and also kind of describing aspects of intelligent energy and the creator. And there's other terms that they'll be introduced in similar passages. But what's interesting is I'm actually still unsure. So the other terms is like the Tao, the Great Mother, and I think there's one other term. The Tao is the most common term. The Great Mother is the second most common term. And there's a third term I forget. We'll see shortly. But I don't believe that there's a one-to-one correspondence with intelligent infinity, intelligent energy, and the creator. But if you take all of those three concepts as a grouping, intelligent infinity, intelligent energy, and the creator, it does seem to correspond with the three concepts, maybe in a different packaging or a different distribution of sub-concepts of Tao, the Great Mother, and the third concept we'll come across. So it's quite interesting to kind of see someone who, you know, to me has experienced, you know, intelligent infinity, but they're trying to put it in words. And does anyone else have any maybe comments or raw passages or any sort of confederation material that this reminds them of?
I would say all the stuff about darkness really reminds me of Matrix of Spirit. That given the fact that they're talking about this kind of like beginning state in darkness and not being able to see things clearly, yeah.
So I can't see you guys because I'm sharing my screen. So just please speak up. Yeah. So one other, I totally agree, Jeremy. And one other passage that also really came to mind was the one where Ra talks about, at least in third density, if you are to graduate on either, I think both positive and negative, it is essential for you to understand that understanding is not of this density. And so for me, the whole like it cannot be described. The name can be spoken is not the eternal name. It kind of is a similar kind of understanding that that Lao Tzu had on the nature of creation. That ultimately you can kind of see aspects of it and feel aspects of it, but you can't fully understand it with the mind, at least not here in third density. All right, so the next verse I wanted to go over was the second verse, and this verse I put in the category of kind of describing polarity. And I think there's portions of this worth reading. And by the way, when I say the category of polarity, I'm not just talking about positive and negative. I'm talking about the polarity as a concept, like as abstract opposites, you know. Okay. When people see things as beautiful, ugliness is created. When people see things as good, evil is created. Being and non-being produce each other. Difficult and easy complement each other. Long and short define each other. High and low oppose each other. Fore and aft follow each other. Therefore, the master can act without doing anything and teach without saying a word. Things come her way and she does not stop them. Things leave and she lets them go. She has without possessing and acts without expectation. When her work is done, she take no credit. That is why it will last forever. So any similar kind of parallel passages or concepts in the Confederation material that this verse reminds you of? Does anyone remember the balancing concept of, with respect to the first two paragraphs, does anyone remember the balancing concepts I think talked about in Raw, that it can be useful to explore the opposites in order to achieve balancing, right? I'm assuming they're shaking heads because I can't see you guys. So
the concept of balance seems to be that we kind of have to know ourselves at both extremes in order for the middle, for the moderate way to be sort of tangible.
Boom, Jeremy, you're on point, because what you just said, it actually foreshadows basically a future verse that almost, I wouldn't say word for word, but sentence for sentence basically says what you said. And so, okay, so with respect to the last paragraph, how about that? This is the last paragraph, I would say, is a different sort of polarity. But, you know, the idea of things come her way and she does not stop them. Things leave and she lets them go. She has without possessing, acts without expectation. Does that remind anyone of anything in the Confederation material? Like, just broadly.
I don't want to take anybody else's thunder.
So how about the concept of the positive path and acceptance, right? Does that kind of ring true for anyone? At least for me, you know, living without, or trying to kind of remove expectations, although not necessarily in the sense of the Buddhist sense of removing expectations such that there's inaction, but basically exactly what it says: acts without expectation. So you act, but you don't have any firm expectation, even though you're obviously acting with a direction in mind. You're not just acting randomly, right? So let's see here. I want to just see if there's an easier way, because it's so distracting if I can't see you. Okay, so you can still see what I'm sharing. Okay, great. So that kind of really struck as a positive polarity thing. So let's go to the next one here, or the next.
I'd say also the concept of things coming to, not to positive entities, but through them.
Right, exactly.
Attachment, even though you are like the receiver of what comes from above.
Yeah, it's there's a lot of there's a lot of interesting discussion of masculine, feminine energy and concepts in this material. And it's also, I talked to Jeremy 101 the other day, that, and I maybe mentioned this in the past, that this is really like an area of archetypal energy. And when I say archetypal energy, once again, it's not directly, there's this one card about it, but it's present in a lot of cards. But masculine, feminine energy, and once again, just a disclaimer, I'm not saying it's linked to a particular gender. I'm just saying the spiritual concepts of masculine, feminine energy has been something I've been, frankly, deeply studying the past few years, just to get a better understanding of it, because it actually feels pretty, it feels to me, at least, based on my meditations, truly archetypal energy. It exists outside of human society. It exists in the animal kingdom. It probably exists in the 1D inanimate world as well. I think it's related to, just to not sidetrack too much more, but I think it's related to perhaps the previous logos that's described in Ra, where it was a mover and a moved. I don't think there's a one-to-one mapping between mover and moved to masculine, feminine, but I feel like it's a more advanced concept built upon those basic concepts. Okay, so verse 7, the Tao of heaven is eternal, and the earth is long enduring. Why are they enduring? They do not live for themselves, thus they are present for all beings. The master puts herself last and finds herself in the place of authority. She detaches herself from all things, therefore she is united with all things. She gives no thought to the self, and that's with a small s. She is perfectly fulfilled. So once again, this is very much unity consciousness, which is present in a lot of systems, of course, and as well as the Confederation material. So just kind of some similarities there. So the next one. This one I put in the category of, once again, a lot of these earlier quotes are in the polarity section. This one I felt very much described, acceptance versus control. So nurture the darkness of your soul until you become whole. Can you do this and not fail? Can you focus your life breath until you become supple as a newborn child? When you cleanse your inner vision, will you be found without fault? Can you love people and lead them without forcing your will on them? When heaven gives and takes away, can you be content with the outcome? When you understand all things, can you step back from your own understanding? Giving birth and nourishing, making without possessing, expecting nothing in return, to grow yet not to control, this is the mysterious virtue. So, I do like looking at religions and ancient philosophies. I think at this time in 500 BC in China, which is before Confucianism, I don't think there was actually, well, I'm not too familiar, but someone can correct me if I'm wrong. But at that point, I don't think there was a lot of religions or philosophies that at least have written records that had a lot of positive polarity material in them. I'm sure they're out there, but I'm not familiar with anyone that kind of were written down. So to me, this verse screams to me of someone who understands, the positive versus negative path, acceptance versus control, but is trying to explain it to like a society that like basically has never experienced these ideas in any capacity. So I think it's kind of interesting, all the different versions that they give. Any other comments on that?
It is surprisingly positive.
Right? Yeah.
So many of these, like you were saying, so many of these earlier things are kind of fear-based and punishment. And this, it reminds me like where there's hate, let's sow love. Where there's, that's some famous, you know what I'm talking about probably. And but yeah, this whole like it's almost like a list of, can you look into yourself? And it's very, there's so, I don't know how to phrase this, but there's so few like, or religious or spiritual texts that like asks you like, can you go into yourself and still love yourself? Like it's very surprisingly positive.
Yeah.
I appreciate you saying that, Jamie, because I think you helped me understand the earlier part of that passage. As we get past the second and third sentence, it makes a lot more sense. Like to me, this is like the mystery of instrumentality, right? How do you be an agent that doesn't have ends of your own, but is only an agent, as a purpose that's given to you from above, right? And you're kind of like acting at 90 degrees to that, to be a conduit for it. But that nurture the darkness of your soul until you become whole. I didn't really understand that quite as well as when you pointed out that you need to like kind of go within yourself in those parts that are maybe not appreciated.
Yeah, there's so few of, a lot of spiritual philosophies speak about, oh, you gotta do the inner work and you gotta be okay with yourself and balance yourself, but so few just give like a whole example of it right here. Like, nurture the darkness of your soul until you become whole. That's like shadow work. Can you focus your life breath until you become supple as a newborn child? That's like meditative. Can you discipline yourself enough to be softened? Like while you cleanse your inner vision, will you be found without fault? Like that's maybe there's so many. These are just great little exercises, like, because so few spiritual things have like here are the mechanics of balancing yourself and disciplining your personality. I think it's pretty cool.
Yeah, honestly, when I found the Tao Te Ching, and I found this particular translation based on a webpage that gave me the 10 different translations of verse 1, because it's not very long. I think I read it in like a day. So there's definitely some, to me, as I said, I think probably Lao Tzu did exist, or at least if the alternative was there's a group of authors, or at least one of the group, if it was a group of authors, definitely open the gateway to intelligent infinity. Because they just understand, in a way that they're clearly kind of struggling to put into words. So I found a lot of wisdom in just reading over it. All right, so the next one, this one I put into techniques. This concept actually is in a lot of different spiritual practices. 30 spokes are joined together in a wheel, but it is the center hole that allows the wheel to function. We mold a clay into a pot, but it is the emptiness inside that makes the vessel useful. We fashion wood for a house, but it is the emptiness inside that makes it livable. We work with the substantial, but the emptiness is what we use. I just love this because it's, once again, the concept you just talked about, both Jamie and Jeremy, where it's almost like you become a vessel, right? And it's like it's very difficult to be a vessel. In a certain sense, you're always a vessel for the creator, but it's very difficult to be a vessel when you have all these distortions, because you're just you might be a vessel, but then it's all filtered through your distortions, and so whatever is happening is just distorted, right? It's not an undistorted vessel for the creator to flow through and be an instrument of. So for me, when I think a lot of times about crystallizing the rays or undistorting oneself, it's very similar to these analogies, right? Where you almost, now to be clear, you can go the other way with these analogies, where you can go in a more Buddhist way, or at least for certain types of Buddhists, where you're like, oh, I have no desire whatsoever and stuff like that. And I do think lack of attachment and not having strong desires is a part of it. But I think a lot of forms of Buddhism take it so far as to deny the red ray, deny a desire to live and enjoy life, which I consider very red, orange, and even maybe yellow. So the emptiness that I see this as is more of, you can still live your life to the fullest, but it's just making yourself, healing yourself, undistorting yourself, crystallizing yourself enough that you can be a very clear vessel for the one infinite creator, to flow through you.
That's cool. I'm glad you brought up the desire part, Nithin, because it was just before I went to go take my bread out of the oven, but like on the first page, it talked about like being without desire. And that's another concept you often find in Buddhism and whatnot. But I do think that maybe at some point being without desire is a fruitful part of your process. But I mean, the mechanism of desire is kind of built into our system. And I think that it can be done with great positive impact and with service. I mean, someone else should talk about it now.
No, I totally agree. Being kind of having a hermit-like existence, I think is very, very useful, where, I think at all times, in order to even just live, there's some minute desire. But being basically a person or an individual who, sits in meditation for like 2 years in the forest, even though there's some desires there, that's a very, very minimal level of desire, right? I think that's absolutely intensely useful on the path. But what is interesting is I found this true in my own journey, and I would say there's strong support for this in the raw material. So does anyone remember? So first, let me back up. There's many mystical traditions where a kind of hermit-like existence, just sitting in quiet prayer and meditation, basically allows one to be harvested from third density, in my understanding. I see that in I see that in stories of Buddhism. I mean, Buddha, right? I see that in stories of Hindu mystics, autobiography of a yogi. I can't pronounce his name, but if you haven't read that one, that's a great one. It's very popular. It's like on the bestseller list. But basically, there's a lot of examples of mystics who kind of, although in his life, even though that autobiography is not a person who retreats from society and deep in meditation, he does go through that period. And his master, his guru, which is very much I'm sure everyone's familiar with what a guru is, but his guru is very much a person who kind of lived much more secluded. I mean, I think he had a few disciples, but he didn't really do too much, is my understanding. And especially if you go down the lineage, the more you go a few generations down, and then it's just some hermit in the wilderness in the Himalayas, right? I think that is a path that allows you to harvest positively, for sure. But what's interesting is, does anyone remember what Ross said happened to the human beings that achieved positive self-harvest in the second cycle? What they chose to do after achieving that? Or what the options were and what they chose? Anyone? Brian?
They stayed to help the bodhisattva.
Exactly. So who knows how they got to that place where they could self-harvest? Maybe it was through action. Maybe it was through living life normally. Maybe it was through a very meditative experience. But I guarantee you, and this is me reasoning out and speculating and also drawing from my own life, I guarantee you when they chose to come back, either that life, like, retreat from the wilderness, or when they reincarnated, the way they're helping out the rest of human society is by living in it. I don't think that they're going to be spending many lives in the Himalayas by themselves. It's very much going to be action oriented. And I've also found that to be true in my life. So I first discovered the raw material about 12 years ago. I definitely went through, I never did the full hermit thing. I was always living in society. I never went to the forest, although I was drawn to that. But, there were periods of time where, after business school, maybe 5 years after they found the raw material, after business school, I was looking for a job, but I was taking my time. And, those 9 months, I think I was like meditating maybe one and a half hour daily. And it was a very fruitful experience for me. But what I ultimately realized was it was very necessary. I definitely was able to crystallize and learn certain things and process certain traumas. But once I had done a certain amount of clearing and undistorting and emptying myself of those distortions, I realized that at a deep level, I incarnated here for a mission here on Earth. I mean, we all incarnate here for two reasons, right? If you're on the positive path, or maybe if you're beyond polarity at sixth density. Basically, to learn something for yourself, right? Presumably to perfect the balance between wisdom and compassion, which is a big thing for sixth density entities, but also to, pure service to others, helping others in a very organic, physical way. Certainly, I think you can be service to others if you're meditating in the Himalayas and on planetary energies, but I'm talking about like in a daily life, right? Being an example of it. At least that rings true for my life. That's why, I realized I need to be down in the trenches here, talking to people in very dark places. And not necessarily talking about philosophy, but just just radiating love, right, in every interaction and being that example. So that's a long kind of a side note on action and I don't like to say action and inaction. I like to more think of it in how I define the masculine and feminine energies earlier. It's like masculine being directing, giving, and creating, and maybe feminine being receiving and attracting and allowing. There's an interplay between those two. And I think that even though maybe in a spiritual sense, you might be more focused on one, they both are very essential for all of us here on Earth, I think, Okay. That was a long monologue. So any comments on that? Okay.
Well, I think it's really interesting how you characterize Taoism as feminine because, you know, at the same time there was in China there was Confucianism, and it, you know, that's very masculine, I would say. So that's, you know, interesting. It's like, you know, you have this surge of Confucianism, which is highly like rational and organized. It's about duties and hierarchy, and then you have this possibly reaction or counterbalance of Taoism, which yeah, is almost entirely focused on like the flow, the receptivity, you know, the empty vessel type of thing. So interesting.
Yeah, no, I wasn't that familiar with Confucianism, but it makes sense. It definitely felt like when I was reading this, it felt like it was a very feminine oriented energy reaction to some sort of masculine energy that was in the vicinity of the time or the person who wrote this or the group of authors who wrote this.
Yeah, I think that's historical that Taoism, I think coming out of like a folk tradition grew up in the context of a pretty rigid and strict Confucian domination. So interesting.
So this verse 14 is one I put into the category of intelligent infinity, intelligent energy, and the creator. So the third term, which is the least referred to term in this in the book, Tao Te Ching. So I mentioned three terms, right? And I don't think there's a one-to-one correspondence, but they're very much similar concepts. So Tao, right? The Tao itself, the Great Mother, and then the other concept that's occasionally referred to is the One. So, you know, I'm just going to read this quote. Look for it and it can't be seen. Listen for it and it can't be heard. Grasp for it and it can't be caught. These three cannot be further described, so we treat them as the One. Its highest is not bright. Its depths are not dark. Unending, unnameable, it returns to nothingness, formless forms and imageless images, subtle beyond all reasoning. Approach it and you will not see a beginning. Follow it and there will be no end. When we grasp the Tao of the ancient ones, we can use it to direct our life today. To know the ancient origin of the Tao, this is the beginning of wisdom. So, you know, it seems like, once again, this is a person who solo or very small groups made contact to intelligent infinity, experienced things, and is trying to put into words. And not doing a bad job, frankly, because this is probably a translation, right? So it's just very interesting to me in that, unlike I guess other, even you know, because I read the Bhagavad Gita, and there's similar passages, but this one, out of a lot of stuff I've read, including Buddhist material, it really actually gets pretty close to, I feel like, describing, you know, aspects of intelligent infinity and intelligent energy as described in the Confederation philosophy. You know?
Yeah, especially the creative aspects of it, the potentiating aspects of it, right? How it is a sort of a well for like everything that then comes into form and is then limited by it, right?
Absolutely. Hey, so just how are we doing on time? Because I probably want to go at least 15 more minutes, but I could probably go a good 35 minutes. So where are we, how is everyone situated on time?
That 35 sounds fine. Anybody got any time constraints?
Okay. So let's go to the next one. Next one I put in under the technique. So, you know, this one, I'm sure you guys will see exactly what they're talking about. If you can empty your mind of all thoughts, your heart will embrace the tranquility of peace. Watch the workings of all creation, but contemplate the return to the source. All creatures in the universe return to the point where they began. Returning to the source is tranquility because we submit to heaven's mandate. Returning to heaven's mandate is called being constant. Knowing the constant is called enlightenment. Not knowing the constant is the source of evil deeds because we have no roots. By knowing the constant, we can accept things as they are. By accepting things as they are, we become impartial. By being impartial, we become one with heaven. By being one with heaven, we become one with the Tao. Being one with Tao, we are no longer concerned about losing our life because we know the Tao is constant and we are one with the Tao. So the main reason I include this verse is, I think pretty obviously, they're basically referring to meditation or quiet contemplation or quiet prayer in the first paragraph here, first two paragraphs. So, it's they're basically giving us some techniques as to how to apply this to our own life. All right. So, okay, I'm not sure we're going to go over all the leadership ones, but this is this is very much leadership oriented. The best leaders, and I thought this was very fascinating because I think if you've ever taken traditional leadership classes, or maybe not traditional, but recent leadership classes, typically there's a dichotomy of what they call directive leadership. I think these are the terms. There's two concepts. It's directive. I'm pretty sure that's what one way is called. And the other way is called empowering leadership. And so what's interesting is this is very much this is like the most extreme form of empowering and we'll talk about why. The best leaders are those the people hardly know exist. The next best leader is a leader who's loved and praised. Next comes the one who is feared. The worst one is the leader that is despised. If you don't trust the people, they will become untrustworthy. The best leaders value their words and use them sparingly. When she has accomplished her task, the people say, amazing, we did it all by ourselves. So very much like, and frankly, when I looked into this from a polarity perspective, in general, you can have directive and empowering compatible with all polarities. But I think long term, because bottom line, empowering is like you really enable people to learn and grow and become ultimately better. All studies show that empowering people, empowering leadership, the organization becomes better long term. The one benefit though of directive is like you tell them step by step how to do everything, and you don't really trust them to make their own decisions. But there are benefits to directive is if you're only worried about short-term performance, because directive, you don't worry about training them. You spend purely time on just telling them to have them follow a bunch of steps without maybe even understanding what they're doing. So I'm not saying that empowering has to be only positive, but bottom line is I think if you're talking about long-term productivity or being long-term with the organization, empowering is definitely much more positive because you're building up the people themselves, right? So it was just interesting in that this is like, you're so empowering that the people just think that they did themselves, right? So I just thought that was interesting kind of leadership lesson. And, to be frank, I don't know how realistic it is in this day and age, because I feel like if you don't get recognized in some small aspect for your leadership, you will be removed from that position, most likely, right? And then someone else who's a shit leader will take your place. So I feel like a little bit idealistic here, unless maybe it made sense back in the day when you had basically divine monarchy, and if you were the king, you'd stay the king, even if no one thought you're doing anything. But I feel in this day and age, if you're this sort of leader where they don't even realize, where they think they did it all by themselves, you're going to get removed. But that's just me as an aside. So,
well, the way to affirm your value is to walk away. See if they really do it on their own.
I mean, maybe this is a problem, maybe not. If you can walk away and no other leader replaces you, that's fine. But what always happens when there's a void, some power-hungry person jumps in and becomes a horrible leader or a horrible manager, right? I feel like that always happens. But
this is why it's so important to trust the people,
right?
Because then there's strength and depth, rather than it all hinging on this leader being able to direct it or not. Even if you need the leader to empower everyone, like that's a crutch in a way, right?
So what I'm hearing then, Jeremy, is this kind of philosophy very consistent with anarchism in a certain way?
I mean, I don't think it even goes that far. I think it's simply the fact that what actually gets done by groups and who actually takes the credit for it are two wild. It's telling ourselves a story about a phenomenon versus the phenomena in and of itself.
Very true.
You can expand it even beyond group dynamics. But I certainly agree that the anarchist idea of anarchy as order, it's the state and control that creates chaos because it tries to direct everything and it creates a mess. Whereas like when you let things naturally grow, you have problems, but when they're solved in depth. They're solved in a way that everybody can kind of get around,
Totally agree. All right. So the next one, let's see here. Okay. So out of all the verses, I categorize the most verses in the kind of technique category. So I'm not going to go over all of them, but this one just jumps out literally like word for word for a confederation exercise. If you want to become whole, first let yourself become broken. If you want to become straight, first let yourself become twisted. If you want to become full, first let yourself become empty. If you want to become new, first let yourself become old. Those whose desires are few get them. Those whose desires are great go astray. For this reason, the master embraces the Tao as an example for the world to follow. Because she isn't self-centered, people can see the light in her. Because she does not boast of herself, she becomes a shining example. Because she does not glorify herself, she becomes a person of merit. Because she wants nothing from the world cannot overcome her. When the ancient master said, if you want to become whole, then first let yourself become broken, they weren't using empty words. All who do this will be made complete. Right? I mean, once again, this is exploring the opposite concepts when in order to undistort yourself. And also it's exploring your subconscious and your shadow side, right? Like, because if for me, when I was reading this, I was like, in my own journey, if you have the thought of it would be nice to be more healed or more whole, or it'd be nice to be more straight or more full, having that thought, if you're honest with yourself, arises because there's some part of you that believes you're not whole, that you're not straight, or that you're not full, right? And so then you have to go there to that place where you feel broken, where you feel twisted, where you feel empty. And I love how it just tells you to do that, right? Because it's first saying, if you want to become whole, if you don't even think about the concept of wholeness, you're probably already whole, right? At some level. Or you're that, or you're very much not self-aware. But assuming you have some moderate level of self-awareness, if you're not worried about, like, to be fair, I've never really struggled, generally speaking, with the concept of being straight or having good morals, more or less. So I didn't really have to go too deep. I mean, everyone has a few examples, but I never had to go too deep into like, oh, I have these bad morals that I need to balance. Maybe one recent example, but the other ones, the whole, I wanted to become whole for most of my life. And the only way to do that was I had to go deep into my brokenness, or what part of me felt broken, for many years. So I just love this as a technique. Okay. So let's see here. Next one is 25. So this one is another one I put in the creator category. Before the universe was born, there was something in the chaos of the heavens. It stands alone and empty, solitary and unchanging. It is ever present and secure. It may be regarded as the mother of the universe. Because I do not know its name, I call it the Tao. If forced to give it a name, I would call it great. Because it is great means it is everywhere. Being everywhere means it is eternal. Being eternal means everything returns to it. Tao is great, heaven is great, earth is great, humanity is great. Within the universe, there are the four great things. Humanity follows the earth, earth follows heaven, heaven follows the Tao only follows itself. So the reason I like this is just for the first paragraph, because once again, to me, it's someone who has grasped the concepts of intelligent infinity, intelligent energy, and the creator, but is trying to put it into words. And I don't think necessarily they put it in the same categories. Like the Tao, the great mother, or sorry, the Tao, the mother, and they call it the great mother at places. And the one, as I said, I don't think there's a one-to-one correlation, but it's very much describing those concepts, right? So I don't know. I just like, even through the translation, I was like, wow, the person on the other end who is writing this has definitely like grasped the ultimate reality. So I just really love that. All right, so 25. And hey, chime in if you have anything. That one's a technique one. There's a lot in techniques, so we'll skip over that. 36. So there's a lot of good techniques that are basically talking about in that category of exploring opposite concepts to undistort yourself. So this is just another example of that. And I won't read the whole thing, but if you want something to return to the source, then you must first allow it to spread out. If you want something to weaken, you must first allow it to become strong. If you want something to be removed, you must first allow it to flourish. If you want to possess something, you must first give it away. And it's not just exploration of opposite concepts, it's also their exploration of acceptance. And also, there's a feminine touch to this. The soft and pliable overcomes the hard and flexible. So it's It's definitely more of that kind of a confederation technique that we spoke about earlier. All right.
Just on a personal note, I understand its value, but like if you want to possess something, you must give it away. That's something personally that I find challenging. Like I have such like a kind of like a absorption or hold on to stuff. Like just as today, like as my husband and I are like preparing to give some stuff to the thrift store and going through some old clothes and stuff. It's like, oh yeah, maybe I'll wear it. Or even on just a simple little material level, that's something that I find kind of challenging to give stuff away. So just thought I'd put that in there.
And I love that you specifically spoke of that sentence, because for me, that sentence is so deep. If you want to possess something, you must first give it away. I've used that technique. That's one of the most powerful techniques, and it's not just for physical items. So, I used the other day, everyone has anxiety. I probably have a lot of anxiety, as Jeremy reminds me sometimes on and off whenever I try to talk about anxiety. But, just fears and concerns. It's like, look, if you want to, so for example, one of my fears and concerns is just starting a new job. I mean, logically, anxiety is often not rational, right? So logically, this doesn't make sense because, historically, I've always been a great attorney. I've been an attorney for like over 9 years in criminal defense, but the anxiety is like, well, you haven't been a public defender recently. You haven't been practicing in California recently because most of your experience was back in 2008 to 2013. And so it's this idea that, obviously all of us want to be great at our job usually. So I was like, man, I really want to do well at my first, preliminary hearing trial, right? And honestly, the best way to get rid of that anxiety is, one, having confidence and really faith in yourself that you will you're likely going to do an excellent job. But even if you don't, you'll learn from that failure. And then the important thing that also really helps for me remove that anxiety is to allow and concede and accept that maybe you'll just fuck it up completely and be completely embarrassed and make a fool of yourself your first time. That's not rational. It's very low probability. But just be like, hey, I give space in my reality to completely fuck this up, completely fuck it up. And you visualize how it'd feel and everything. And you'd be like, sometimes reality throws you curveballs, and maybe however slim that chance is, this will happen. And even if that happens, to accept it, and this acceptance comes from an understanding of this concept that if you want to possess that, becoming a great attorney, you must first give away and accept that you might not be a good attorney initially. You might be a horrible attorney. And that's a part of the path, that failure. And it's like, just doing that, it releases all the tension because you know yourself, you're going to do a great job, but you allow yourself to fuck it up, and you allow because if you don't do that, what happens is every small hiccup, maybe you're prepping the case up and, oh fuck, you thought you had this document, but it's not in the electronic case system. Whoever was uploading was fucked it up, and shit, maybe you should have checked more than 3 days ago because the person who uploads it is off duty. So now you're jammed for time. So then, having this experience now increases the chance that you'll fuck it up in 3 days because there's no good way to get around this. Well, if you've already given yourself permission to fuck it up, it takes that edge off. You're no longer that sense of natural panic that might rise for that few seconds. You're like, hey, maybe this is a sign the universe is telling me this is the curveball, but I already accepted that a curveball might happen. You're still going to try and do your best. You're still going to, maybe see if someone else can, from IT can upload that document, whatever. But you're going to ultimately have allowed, prior to this little hiccup or prior to the multiple hiccups, you'll already have mentally allowed, if the creator wants to give you that experience, you're like, hey, I'm down. I'm cool. I understand that sometimes the catalyst comes hard and fast, and it might come through like botching something at work. Now, as I said, 99.9% of the time, it's literally pure fear, emotion, anxiety talking, and you don't botch it. And what's interesting is if you don't handle that anxiety, that 99.9%, you end up, if you have that anxiety, it increases the chance you attract those experiences, right? So if you do truly fear it and you haven't accepted that you might botch it up and you are really worried, you might try harder if you use that adrenaline to focus you. But bottom line is, I feel in my experience, you actually end up attracting more of those botched experiences where shit gets fucked up. So it's a very interesting thing. If you want to possess something, you must first give it away. It's about expectations, about physical items. I found that particular line very, very provocative and wise. And hats off to J.H. McDonald, because it's his translation, right? Okay. So the next one here, let's see, 39. That's another polarity one. We've kind of covered that one already. Okay, this is another technique one, but I just thought it was funny, so I commented on it. I like that. I'm just going to talk about the first paragraph, because it kind of is true to a little bit. So when you first discover your spirituality, right, you want to talk about it to fucking everyone. Sorry, excuse my language. But even after you integrate it, sometimes you'll occasionally talk about it to someone, and you'll get wildly different responses, right? So once again, this is a translation, so don't take superior to be superior, okay? When a superior person hears of the Tao, she diligently puts it into practice. When an average person hears of the Tao, he believes half of it and doubts the other half. When a foolish person hears of the Tao, he laughs out loud at the very idea. If he didn't laugh, it wouldn't be the Tao. I love that. I love that. You know, it's been so true to my experiences of talking about this. Although nowadays I'm able to usually filter it a little bit better. So if I figure they're probably going to laugh or whatever, I don't talk about it, whatever. But anyway, it's this strikes me as a person who's like been desperately trying to spread positive philosophy, and like no one has been fucking listening to them, right? Like, and that's probably why they went out the Western Gate. So anyway, 42. Okay, so this is the final. There's only 4 verses that I felt really was the author trying to describe their experiences with intelligent infinity and intelligent energy in the creator. This is the final one. The Tao gave birth to 1. The 1 gave birth to 2. The 2 gave birth to 3. The 3 gave birth to all of creation. All things carry yin, yet embrace yang. They blend their life breaths in order to produce harmony. People despise being orphaned, widowed, and poor, but the noble one take these as their titles. In losing, much is gained, and in gaining, much is lost. What others teach, I too will teach. The strong and violent will not die a natural death. So any comments before I get into my thoughts on this? So let me first start off with the third paragraph here. People despise being orphaned, widowed, and poor, but the noble ones take these as their titles. In losing, much is gained, and in gaining, much is lost. To me, this speaks of basically between incarnations, picking your catalyst, right? You'd probably pick being orphaned, being poor. Maybe you can even pick before your incarnation that you're going to be widowed, because it doesn't make sense in life. You can't really pick those. I mean, I guess if you murder your spouse, you can pick being widowed, but you can't really. And I guess to be fair, you can pick being poor. You can give away all your wealth. You can't pick being orphaned. I don't really see, because of yeah. So to me, this actually speaks of reincarnation. And what's interesting is with the first verse, the Tao gave birth to 1, 1 gave birth to 2, 2 gave birth to 3, 3 gave birth to all of creation. When Ra describes how creation, I should have looked this up. Maybe a lifeline here can help me. But there's a Ra quote, and I think there's Confederation quotes on this too, about there's a progression to how physical reality was created, right? It was something like first there was intelligent energy. First there was intelligent infinity, right?
You're talking about the first 3 distortions, right?
Right. Intelligent infinity, and then the distortion of, was it free will first? And then the distortion of love, and then the distortion of light?
The first distortion is free will, the second is love, and the third is light.
And then after those distortions, intelligent energy created the universe, like the physical universe, right? Or is that not clear? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, that's good enough. Like,
you'll give me a pass.
It's probably beyond words. But there's something about the significance of light as making, I think, all of this like manifest and physically tangible.
Right. So I think the fact you noted that it's beyond words is probably what this person was trying to put down and couldn't, right? Like they're just putting 1, 2, 3, and 3 is all creation, right? So yeah, I just thought it was very interesting. All right, so this next one is actually I put this verse on very much a discussion of kind of like masculine, feminine energies. That which offers no resistance overcomes the hardest substance. That which offers no resistance can enter where there is no space. Few in the world can comprehend the teaching without words or understand the value of non-action. So once again, I think he's, in a certain sense, they're describing an aspect of so-called feminine energy of kind of attracting and receiving. Let's see here. That was. Let's see. The next quote will be on, I think, another technique quote. You know, I'm gonna not focus on the technique quotes because there's a lot of them. They're a little bit redundant at this point, and just focus on the. So we covered all the intelligent affinity creator quotes. We're almost done with the polarity quotes. So the remaining quotes will be about leadership and the masculine, feminine energies here. Okay, so let's see here. This is a leadership quote. Govern your country with integrity. Weapons of war can be used with great cunning, but loyalty is only won by not doing. Once again, that kind of feminine energy. How do I know the way things are? By these. The more prohibitions you make, the poorer people will be. The more weapons you possess, the greater the chaos in your country. The more knowledge that is acquired, the stranger the world will become. The more laws that you make, the greater the number of criminals. Therefore, the master says, I do nothing and people become good by themselves. I seek peace and people take care of their own problems. I do not meddle in their personal lives and the people become prosperous. I let go of all my desires and the people return to the uncarved block. You know, this I don't know much about anarchism, but it feels like it's related to that, right, Jeremy?
Yeah, and yes, absolutely. But I think it's more, but I think there's also this aspect I got from it of what you were talking about earlier about removing your own expectations. I wonder how much of this is about effecting something on other people and the reality outside of yourself, and how much of it is a kind of another way of talking about the magical act, which to my mind is all about manipulating one's own perception so that the reality one perceives changes, right? Like, and are we talking about two different things there, right? Are they really kind of the same, one and the same thing?
You know, that brings up a great point. In my exploration of kind of you know, masculine, feminine energies, is I'm slowly coming to the opinion that I think they're concepts that are inherently about physical reality, because the dichotomy between giving, creating, directing versus receiving and attracting completely start to break down once you start to read certain passages like in Ra, where they say that, you know, the adept, there's a passage that directly says the adept starts to focus on things that cannot be, the changes cannot be seen in their physical reality. Like they focus on planetary energies and stuff. So they're still taking action, but it's no longer an action that can be physically seen. So if you can't physically see it, it almost becomes pointless to start trying to break it down into masculine and feminine, because who knows if you're attracting it or if you're creating it, because either way you can't verify the okay, so to word it another way, masculine and feminine energies seem to be inherently tied to the concept of time and causal chains. So like if you can't determine the cause, it's very difficult to break down. If there's an event and you can't determine the cause, it's very difficult to break it down into the masculine, feminine energies that created it. Because if you don't know what created it, because maybe there's an adept meditating in the middle of nowhere, but even that adept probably didn't know that overt change, right? So I think that even if you're taking action to affect reality, you know, and as Ra says, the adept becomes more and more satisfied with changes that they cannot see, or that the changes that they're affecting changes that cannot be seen on the physical plane, I think is the language they use, right? it makes this seeming distinction between masculine and feminine energies, at least as I understand them currently, kind of moot, because if you can't establish a chain of causation, it doesn't matter at that point, right?
Paging Dr. Brian to bring in some Leibniz here, but because Brian and I had a really long conversation about causality, and I think you're actually putting a much more condensed and focused point on it, which is that the drama of learning and growth and transformation comes from the decoupling of source and destination, receiving and giving, right? Like, to tease these out is to start to get some like definition into what otherwise is undifferentiated, a whole, and therefore not to be plumbed. I totally get what you're saying here. I think.
Yeah, I mean, well, thank you, because I just part of that I just came up on the fly. So good that it's not totally BS. All right, so
it's tough because when we're talking about the law of one and we talk about gestures towards a mystery that cannot be encapsulated in the words, right? Like, that's one thing, because we can imagine the mystery, and we can keep in mind that the words and the concepts are mere signifiers of that, right? But when you're talking about two systems that juggle mystery, right? And then you're constantly trying to play one off against the other, like it's hard, because you want there to be a translation between the two, and yet what would that translation possibly entail but a collapsing of that very mystery into concepts and words and limitations? So you've given yourself a very difficult road here, Nithin. I just want to say you're doing a great job.
Thanks for that lifeline. All right, I'll take it. All right, just a little. All right, this one I knew wasn't even on my list, but just funny. Not spending too much time on it. Governing a large country is like frying a small fish. Too much poking spoils the meat. I just thought it was funny. All right, this one I put under masculine, feminine energies again. We don't have to spend too much time on it, but a large country should take the low place like a great watershed, which from its low position assumes the female role. The female overcomes the male by the power of her position. Her tranquility gives rise to her humility. Yeah, very much. Once again, when I was reading this, I was like, wow, this really seems like it's a pushback to what the author or authors were experiencing to perhaps be a distorted form of masculinity, because this is super strong, like, right, feminine stuff, which is fine. But I just, like, from my understanding, I feel like, I don't know. Maybe you don't need maybe you don't need a balanced practice of masculine, feminine energies in your spiritual practice. Maybe you can fully achieve, whatever the goal, whether it's fourth density harvest or beyond sixth density unity, maybe by focusing on just one aspect of, like, maybe divine masculinity or divine femininity. I don't know. Maybe that's possible.
To me, it seems more like, are you going to give it attention and definition? Do these concepts become things that you ping off of to get to the destination, or are they inchoate shadows that are within the material you're working with, but you don't call them out into definition and articulation, right? It's like how those of Ra talked about polarity before the veil. They said polarity was always there. Service to others and service to self was always there. It just wasn't called out.
Right. That's
It's
true.
calling out that we can work with it better, but the truth of it is still inside of the one, right?
Yeah. And once again, here's another verse that once again describes, a very feminine approach to kind of understanding reality, which, as I've definitely used this approach. I went through a hermit period. It's very, very useful. So yeah, act by not acting, do by not doing, enjoy the plain and simple, find that greatness in the small, so good stuff. 64. I think there's maybe only a small portion of this that I found really relevant or useful. Okay, so this is interesting. This is actually discussing taking action. So I'm just going to read the second paragraph here. Prevent problems before they arise. Take action before things get out of hand. The tallest tree begins as a tiny sprout. The tallest building starts with one shovel of dirt. A journey of 1,000 miles starts with a single footstep. So this, when I read this paragraph, and especially when I read it today, it embodies a very key understanding to what I would term masculine energy, in that it's about taking action, but it's not just about taking action, but it's about taking action where you might not see the results for a long time. Planting a tree, trying to build a building with one shovel of dirt at a time, basically taking a journey of 1,000 miles, one footstep at a time, right? It's very much taking directed action over a long period of time where you might not see the results immediately, but you're having faith in that you're going to be able to create and directly manifest that goal.
I also think it's interesting that when they do talk about action, finally, when they talk about the virtue of action, because it seems like a lot of what the Tao Te Ching talks about is avoiding action, refraining, like not imposing yourself and your desires on things, right? But instead pulling back. But when they do talk about it, even when you act, it's in the context of having been open and receptive and understanding of the reality that presents before you.
Exactly.
So that when you act, you hit true, right? You're not flailing out. You're not reacting, right? You are taking into account the situation. You're comfortable with it. You've come to peace with it. And then what needs to be done almost calls itself out to you, right?
That's a great point. And it's almost like it brings up this concept that you can have maybe positive masculinity. And I use that very much in the raw term, in a hybrid raw term. I'm creating it. Positive masculinity, negative masculinity, or maybe not masculinity, positive masculine energy and negative masculine energy. Because if we treat, this concept of being it in taking action for the long term, not looking for the quick gain or buck. How many times when we look at publicly traded companies and we say, look, they're taking action just to make some short-term goals for their shareholders, usually to the detriment of society, to the long-term viability of a company. Usually it's stuff like being greedy, whatever, making shoddy products, maybe some fraud or just dumping pollutants, right? Taking the short way out, dumping pollutants into the river instead of making the more maybe expensive product that is clean for the environment. It's almost this concept that if you're taking action and you really want an immediate result soon, it fits much more smoothly into a negative philosophy. Whereas if you're directing and you're taking action, but you're in it for the long term, you don't have to see results tomorrow. You're not going to juice up and get huge muscles in just 3 months. You're willing to do it over a course of, I think they say on average, 1 year of juicing is equivalent to like 5 years of natural or something, 4 years of natural. You're willing to do it long term in a much more sustainable way, with the least amount of harm. That's interesting. I've never thought of what the equivalent positive feminine. Well, I think I understand positive feminine energy. I don't know what the negative feminine energy would be. These are very interesting hybrid concepts.
On that particular hybrid concept that you have just been talking about this like duality to the masculine feminine dichotomy. I would direct you and anybody interested to the first channeling intensive session 7, which is a exploration of the matrix, potentiator, and significator stations in mind, body, and spirit in the archetypal mind. And they talk about how the matrix and potentiator for mind and body are kind of like these 4 different quadrants. Like you have like, so if femininity is receptivity and masculinity is generativeness, right? Like generation, then you have active generation, passive generation, active reception, passive reception, and that the matrix and potentiator for mind and body are kind of like these 4 different like combinations, permutations of these qualities. Don't want to detract, but it's right on the money of what you're saying.
So just finishing up. So bottom line is what I really found interesting for the Tao Te Ching, and I would encourage, look, you can see we're almost near the end. What I encourage anyone who's interested is it's not a very long read. You can just Google Tao Te Ching. McDonald translation, and there's a PDF available. That's how I got this one. I definitely found lines that just, because whenever you're talking about these very difficult to describe concepts, because these concepts are not fully encapsulated by words, right? And a lot of the concepts in here are the concepts that the Confederation talks about. It'll help you understand it in a new way sometimes by just hearing a little different wording of someone who is trying to put the same stuff into words, right? So I think it is a useful thing to kind of look at, and it has some stuff on leadership. I think the stuff that it talks about on leadership to me is not too groundbreaking. It is interesting, but what I really find fascinating is its take on kind of masculine, feminine energies, because the raw material doesn't get too much into it, and it's just very interesting that there's more than a few lines. I think there's other verses in here on like masculine and feminine and action versus inaction. So I found it very useful from that kind of perspective to read into it as well. So yeah, I think it's a great read. I would definitely recommend it. I think it's very much a person who I would ponder, is maybe a wanderer themselves, right? Because these are pretty, I don't know, either a wanderer or they're like a third density child prodigy, because these are very advanced concepts, I feel like, just to figure it out, right? Just through a few thousand lifetimes here on Earth. So with that, I'll open up for discussion. And